He stood there, amidst the laughing crowd, alone, and no one knew that the man they rejected today would be the only one standing between them and death that winter. This is the story of Darius Kane, the man no one wanted to choose, and Eliza Hart, the woman no one saw. If you're watching this video, please hit like and comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has progressed. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will keep you glued to the screen. The matchmaking gathering at Black Hollow was supposed to be a cheerful occasion. That was what Reverend Alcott had promised when he nailed the announcement to the post outside the general store 3 weeks prior. A community gathering he'd written in careful block letters to help lonely settlers find companionship before the hard months arrived. There would be cider. There would be music from the Fenwick brothers and their fiddles. Families would come. Single men and women would stand across from one another and talk, the way civilized people did, and perhaps something would take root. What nobody had written on that announcement, what nobody needed to write because everyone already knew, was the other reason for the gathering. The real reason. The one people whispered about when they thought the subject of their whispering wasn't close enough to hear. Darius Kane had come down from the mountain. He did it maybe twice a year, sometimes less. He'd appear at the edge of town with a wagon half loaded with pelts and smoked meat, conduct whatever business needed conducting at McCready's trading post, and be gone again before most people had finished their morning coffee. He didn't linger. He didn't socialize. He didn't sit on the porch outside the saloon and trade stories with the other men the way settlers did when they needed to remind themselves they were still part of something human. He just came, did what he came to do, and went back up. Most of Black Hollow had decided, somewhere over the years, that this was the correct arrangement for everyone involved. Darius Kane was 34 years old and built like something that had been assembled from leftover pieces of the mountain itself. 6 feet and 4 inches of dense, weathered frame, with hands that looked too large for any ordinary task, and a face that carried the kind of permanent damage that comes not from a single bad event, but from years of accumulated hard weather. There was a scar that ran from his left cheekbone down to the edge of his jaw, pale and ridged against his dark beard. His nose had been broken at least once, possibly twice, and had healed slightly off-center. His eyes were a pale gray that most people found unsettling without being entirely sure why. He'd been in Black Hollow for 6 years. Before that, nobody knew much. He'd arrived with a mule, a rifle, a small amount of money, and no explanation, built his cabin in the high country above the tree line where sensible people didn't try to winter, and apparently decided that was sufficient. The stories about him had accumulated the way stories always did in small frontier settlements. Slowly at first, then all at once, each new version a little more extreme than the last. He'd killed a man in whatever place he came from. He'd killed 2 men. He'd lost a wife and a child, and the grief had made him strange. He talked to animals. He could survive temperatures that would kill an ordinary person. He'd been seen walking through a blizzard without a coat, which several people swore to, and which was almost certainly an exaggeration, but the fact that it was believable said something. What was not an exaggeration, and what people somehow discussed less than the dramatic versions, was that he was competent in ways that most of Black Hollow could only pretend to be. He'd built his cabin alone in 3 months. His winter stores never ran out. When the creek flooded 2 springs ago and took out the bridge on the South Road, he'd come down without being asked and helped rebuild it in 4 days, working longer hours than anyone else and then leaving without waiting for thanks. But competent didn't mean welcome, and the gathering at Black Hollow was very specifically about welcome. Alcott had approached him in September, which took more nerve than most people gave the Reverend credit for. He'd ridden up to the mountain cabin on a gray mare that was clearly unhappy about the elevation and the wind, and he'd made his case carefully. The settlement needed families, needed stability. The long winters were hard on people who faced them alone, and there were women in the valley who might be open to a serious match if approached in the right setting. Darius had listened to all of it from his porch, his arms crossed, saying nothing. "I'm not asking you to be someone you're not," Alcott had said, which was either the most diplomatic thing anyone had ever said to Darius Kane or the most naive. "I'm asking you to come and let people see you as you are." There had been a long pause. "When?" Darius had finally said. Alcott had told him, And somehow, against whatever reasonable judgment he possessed, Darius had said he'd be there. He regretted it approximately 15 minutes after arriving. The gathering was held in the largest structure in Black Hollow, which was the grain hall on the north end of the main street, a wide, drafty building that smelled permanently of sawdust and dried corn, and tonight, the wood smoke from the 2 iron stoves that had been burning since midday to take the chill off the walls. Someone had hung lanterns from the ceiling beams and pushed the storage shelves to the edges to clear space in the center. The Fenwick brothers were set up near the east wall with their fiddles, playing something that was technically cheerful. There were perhaps 40 people inside when Darius arrived. He came in through the side door rather than the main entrance, which was not a deliberate choice to avoid attention, so much as the side door was closer to where he'd tied his horse. But the result was the same. He appeared suddenly in the middle of the room rather than being announced by the creak of the main door, and the effect on the nearest cluster of people was immediate and visible. The talking didn't stop all at once. It stopped in spreading circles, the way ripples move out from a dropped stone, group by group registering his presence and adjusting accordingly. He was wearing clean clothes. He'd made the effort: a dark wool shirt, his least battered coat, boots that had been brushed if not exactly polished. He'd trimmed his beard. He'd done everything a person was supposed to do when they were trying to present themselves acceptably to a gathering of their community. It didn't matter. He could see it in the way people looked at him and then looked away, the quick recalibration of expression from surprise to something more carefully neutral. He could see it in the way a woman near the cider table leaned to the woman beside her and said something in a voice too low to hear, and the way both of them moved 3 steps to the left without appearing to move at all. He got himself a cup of cider and stood near the wall. Alcott ran the formal portion of the event with the brisk efficiency of a man who had organized too many uncomfortable community occasions to be easily rattled. He'd arranged it simply: the eligible men on one side, the eligible women on the other, and introductions made in turn. It was supposed to feel natural. It didn't feel natural. It felt like a livestock auction where everyone was pretending it was a dance. There were 7 men participating. Darius was the last to be introduced. The first 6 went through their turns without incident. There was awkwardness. There was laughter in the polite places. There were a few moments that looked like genuine interest taking root. Thomas Ray, a young farmer from the south end of the valley, made Margaret Fenwick laugh twice, which Alcott noted with visible relief. Then it was Darius's turn. Alcott said his name and the room temperature seemed to drop by several degrees that had nothing to do with the stoves. He stepped forward. He said his name, which was unnecessary since everyone knew it. He said he had a cabin and land in the upper mountain and that he'd been in Black Hollow 6 years. He said he was looking for someone who could work alongside him and wouldn't mind the altitude. It wasn't a speech designed to charm anyone, but it was honest and short, and he said it clearly, and he thought it was at least a reasonable foundation for a conversation. The silence that followed lasted a beat too long. Then Alcott asked carefully which of the women present might be interested in speaking further with Mr. Kane. Nobody moved. It wasn't that they were slow to respond. It was that they'd already decided. He could see it in their faces, not cruelty exactly, but something that had been settled in advance, a conclusion reached before the question was even asked. Agnes Whitmore, who ran the laundry on 2nd Street and had been widowed 2 years prior, looked at the floor. Clara Hess, the miller's daughter, looked at the wall just past his left shoulder. Ruth Lander glanced at the woman beside her and then studied her own hands with sudden, intense interest. The silence stretched, and then, from somewhere near the back of the room, from a man Darius recognized as Frank Pruitt, who ran the feed store and had the disposition of a man who found most things funny that weren't happening to him, came a sound. It started as a low exhale. Then it became a noise. And then Frank Pruitt was laughing. And it was the specific kind of laugh that opens a door for other people, because suddenly 2 or 3 others were laughing too, quiet and then not quiet. And someone said something under their breath that Darius didn't catch, but that produced another ripple of laughter from the people close enough to hear it. He stood there. He didn't move. He didn't change his expression. He'd learned a long time ago that showing people what they'd hit you with was the same as handing them a better weapon, but his jaw tightened. Alcott said firmly, "That's enough," and the laughter subsided, though the grins didn't entirely disappear. Darius set his cup down on the nearest surface, turned, and walked toward the side door. He heard Alcott say his name behind him, something apologetic in the tone. He didn't stop. He pushed through the door, and the cold air hit him like water thrown in his face, sharp and immediate and cleaner than the air inside. He stood on the narrow wooden step outside and breathed it in, and he did not allow himself to think about the laughter, or Frank Pruitt's face, or the careful way those women had looked at everything except him. He was going to get his horse, ride back up the mountain, and close the door behind him. That was the plan. It was what he should have done in September when Alcott rode up with his careful, well-intentioned proposal. It was what he should have done 3 weeks ago when he first considered coming. It was what every piece of reasonable judgment he possessed had told him to do. And he had not listened, and now he had his confirmation that his judgment had been right from the beginning. He was already off the step and moving toward the post where his horse was tied when the grain hall door opened behind him again. He turned, expecting Alcott. It wasn't Alcott. It was a woman he didn't recognize, or rather, a woman he'd seen before but never had cause to notice. She was standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, dark hair loose at the edges of the bun she'd pinned it into, wearing a coat that was technically adequate for the season, but only just. She was heavier than the women who'd been standing on the eligible side of the room, solidly built, a little breathless from moving quickly, her face flushed from the warmth inside and the cold outside. She looked at him, and she didn't look away. "Mr. Kane," she said. "I don't know you," he said. It came out blunter than he intended. "Eliza Hart," she said. "I teach at the schoolhouse on Birch Road." He looked at her for a moment. "All right. I wanted to say—" She stopped, appeared to reconsider whatever she'd been planning to say. "I'm sorry about what happened in there. That was unkind." He studied her face. She seemed to mean it, which was not what he'd expected. People offered apologies on behalf of other people for all kinds of reasons, and most of them were really apologies for having witnessed the thing rather than for the thing itself. But she was looking at him directly, and her expression didn't have the particular quality of discomfort that usually accompanied that kind of offering. "It wasn't your doing," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it still happened." He didn't have a response to that, so he said nothing. She exhaled a small breath that briefly clouded in the cold air between them. "Are you leaving?" "Yes." She nodded, like that was the answer she'd expected. She started to say something else. He could see her working up to it, and then pulling back from it. And then she just said, "All right, safe ride up." She went back inside. Darius stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he untied his horse and rode home. He didn't sleep well that night. This was not unusual for him. He slept the way he did everything else, in practical blocks when the body required it, rather than in long, restful stretches. But tonight the wakefulness had a specific texture. He lay on his back in the dark of the cabin and looked at the ceiling and thought about the laughter in the grain hall, and about Frank Pruitt's face, and about the way the women had looked at the floor and the walls in their own hands. He was not a man who spent a great deal of time on self-pity. It had never struck him as particularly useful. But there was a difference between self-pity and simple accounting, and if he was being honest with himself, and he generally was, because dishonesty required a kind of energy he found wasteful, the honest accounting was this. He had come down from the mountain hoping for something, and he had been reminded very publicly and very specifically that the thing he'd been hoping for was not something Black Hollow was going to give him. He'd known that before he went. He'd known it and gone anyway, because Alcott had used the word community with enough genuine feeling behind it that Darius had, briefly and against his better judgment, believed in the possibility. That was the mistake. Not going. Believing. He got up before dawn and went outside and stood on the porch in the dark and looked out at the valley below. The lights of Black Hollow were invisible from this elevation. Too far, too small, absorbed by the darkness and the distance. Up here, there was only the mountain, the cold, and the specific silence of high altitude at night, which was a different kind of silence than any other, deeper, less interested in you. He'd built his life around that silence. He'd chosen it, or it had chosen him. The distinction had blurred over time. He knew this mountain better than he'd ever known any person. He knew where the snow would drift and where it wouldn't, knew which passes stayed passable longest into winter, knew the hidden spring on the eastern slope that never froze even in the worst months, knew the rock formations that could break a wind that would otherwise take down a structure. He knew how to survive. What he did not know, had perhaps never properly known, was how to be the kind of person that other people found easy to stand near. He stayed on the porch until the sky started to pale at the eastern edge, then went back inside and built up the fire and put water on for coffee and told himself to stop thinking about it. He had firewood to split and a roof section to patch before the first snow and 3 trap lines to check by midweek. He had things to do. That was enough. It wasn't enough. This became apparent to him over the following 2 weeks in a way that was inconvenient and irritating and impossible to ignore. He went about his work, the firewood, the roof, the trap lines, the stores he'd been laying in since August, and he did all of it competently and efficiently, and with the focused attention he brought to every task. And underneath all of it, like a stone in his boot that he kept forgetting and then remembering again, was the specific look on Eliza Hart's face when she'd said, "I'm sorry about what happened in there." That was unkind. He didn't know why that particular moment kept returning. He'd received worse in his life. Much worse. He'd been turned away from more doors than he could count, in places harder and less forgiving than a small frontier settlement, and none of those moments had lodged themselves in his memory the way this one small exchange had. Maybe it was because she'd come after him. Most people didn't come after him. Most people were relieved when he removed himself from situations, and the relief was mutual enough that nobody thought to question the arrangement. She'd come after him. She'd stood in the cold without a proper coat and looked him in the eye and said something that wasn't an excuse or a deflection, and then she'd let him go without making it into anything more than what it was. He found himself, on an afternoon in the second week of October, in the lower valley for a reason he only admitted to himself halfway down the mountain. He needed salt, yes, and he could use more lamp oil, yes, and those were real needs that required a trip to McCready's, but he could have waited another week, and he was not waiting another week. He wasn't going to see her. He just wasn't not going to be in the place where he might see her. The distinction felt important to maintain. He picked up his salt and his oil and 2 spools of wire at McCready's, and then he walked down Birch Road on his way back to where he'd tied his horse, and the schoolhouse was exactly where he'd known it would be. A low, solidly built structure with a covered porch and a stack of firewood along one side, and the sound of children's voices coming through the walls in that specific way they do when a class is moving through something together, all slightly different pitches and rhythms but aiming at the same direction. He didn't stop. He kept walking. He was 3 paces past the building when the door opened and a cluster of children spilled out for a midday break, tumbling past him with the indiscriminate energy of kids who've been sitting still too long, and he stepped to the side to let them pass. And when he looked up, Eliza Hart was standing in the doorway. She saw him. He'd been hoping, in a general and unexamined way, that she might not. "Mr. Kane," she said. "Miss Hart." He held up the paper bag from McCready's. "Salt Run." She looked at the bag and then at him, and something moved across her face that might have been amusement. "That's a long way to come for salt." "Needed other things, too." "Of course." She leaned against the doorframe. She was wearing an apron over her dress, and there was chalk dust on her left hand from where she'd been gripping a piece of it, and she looked tired in the way that teachers always look tired, not exhausted, but carrying the specific weight of a morning's worth of managing other people's children. "How are your students?" he said, which was not what he'd meant to say, and also the only thing he could think of. "Loud," she said. "Curious. 2 of them got into a fight over a marble this morning, and I had to separate them before it became something worse." She paused. "How's the mountain?" "Cold." "Getting colder?" "Always." She nodded. One of the children shouted something from the yard, and she glanced over, checking, the way people with responsibility for children did automatically and constantly. "I should get back," she said. "Yes." He picked up the bag he'd set down. "Mr. Kane." He looked at her. She seemed to be weighing something. Then, "The town's doing another gathering next week. Alcott announced it yesterday. There are a few people, women, who apparently reconsidered." She said it carefully, watching him. I thought someone should tell you. He didn't say anything for a moment. Why? He said. She looked at him steadily. Because you deserve to know. He thought about the grain haul, about Frank Pruitt's laugh, about the floor and the wall and the carefully studied hands. I appreciate the warning, he said. Something shifted in her expression, quick and then controlled, and she said, it wasn't a warning. She went back inside. He went to the second gathering. He couldn't have explained why. He'd replayed the conversation on Birch Road for 4 days and arrived at no useful conclusion except that the woman was straightforward in a way that unsettled him, and the unsettlement was interesting enough that he'd apparently decided to act on it in the most inconvenient possible way. This gathering was smaller, only about 20 people, and the atmosphere was different from the first one. More subdued, the cheerfulness more effortful, like a fire that's been rebuilt from embers rather than freshly lit. The Fenwick brothers were there again, but playing softer, and there was no cider this time, only coffee, which suited the general mood better. Alcott pulled him aside when he arrived, which was not a good sign. I want to be honest with you, Alcott said, in the voice he used when he was about to say something uncomfortable. The women who agreed to come tonight, some of them are genuinely open to having a conversation. Some of them are here because their families encouraged them and they felt they should make an appearance. Which ones are which? Darius said. Alcott opened his mouth and then closed it. I don't think I should. I'm not asking you to make choices for me, Darius said. I'm asking you to tell me which ones are being honest. Alcott looked pained. That's not a question I can answer. Then it's the same as last time, Darius said, and I'll be leaving in 10 minutes. He didn't leave in 10 minutes, because Alcott spent the first 7 of them making introductions with the focused energy of a man trying to prove a point. There were 4 women, Sadie Croft, who was 20 and whose father Darius suspected had done significant persuasion work before tonight. Hannah Bowl, a widow in her 40s who was polite and correct and looked at him the way people look at problems they haven't yet figured out how to solve. A woman whose name he didn't catch, who shook his hand and then spent the conversation looking over his shoulder. And Ruth Lander, who had been at the first gathering and had studied her own hands, and who this time looked directly at him and said, I heard you once carried a man's family down from the high pass when they got caught in the October storm 2 years back. Yes, he said. Is that true? It was 3 adults and 2 children. One of the adults had a broken ankle. It took most of a night. Ruth Lander looked at him for a long moment. Why did you do it? He thought about the question. It seemed like it should have an obvious answer, but the way she asked it suggested she was actually looking for something specific. Because they needed it done, he said. She nodded slowly. My problem, she said, quietly enough that it didn't carry beyond them, is not you. I want you to know that. My problem is the mountain. The mountain's what I have, he said. I know. She looked away, and it was the most honest exchange he'd had with anyone in Black Hollow in 6 years, and it still ended the same way. The gathering wound down. Alcott looked defeated in a way that was probably genuine. The women filed out in 1s and 2s and the space emptied, and Darius was putting his coat back on near the east wall when Frank Pruitt came in through the side door. Pruitt was not part of the gathering. He had no reason to be there. He came in with 2 of his usual companions, Jim Sauer and a younger man named Cole, whose last name Darius didn't know, and they positioned themselves near the coffee table with the easy comfort of men who expected to be tolerated everywhere they went. Another strikeout, Kane? Pruitt said. Darius pulled his second coat sleeve on and said nothing. I'm just saying, Pruitt continued, warming to it, a man ought to know what he can reasonably expect. Some things aren't for everybody. Frank, Alcott said. I'm not being cruel, Pruitt said, with the specific tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. I'm being practical. The women here have choices, and choices matter. That's not a judgment on Kane. It's just arithmetic. Darius turned and looked at Frank Pruitt. Pruitt was a large man, heavy in the chest and shoulders, and he'd been in Black Hollow his whole life and had the specific confidence of someone who had always been exactly where everyone expected him to be. He wasn't a bad man, probably. He was a man who had never been on the wrong side of a room's laughter and therefore had no real understanding of what it cost. The arithmetic you're doing, Darius said, leaves out half the numbers. Pruitt blinked. What? Nothing, Darius said. He picked up his hat and his bag. Good night, Alcott. He went outside. He was standing by his horse, one hand on the saddle, when he heard the door open behind him again. He turned, ready for Alcott. It was Eliza Hart. She was standing on the step in the same inadequate coat, and she'd been crying recently, not actively, but recently, the evidence still visible in the slight redness around her eyes and the careful way she was holding her face, and she looked at him and said without preamble, "My landlord told me today that he's selling the building. I have until the 1st of November. He looked at her. That's 3 weeks. Yes. Where will you go? She let out a breath. I don't know yet. That's what I was trying to figure out while I was sitting in there listening to the end of the gathering. She wasn't asking him for anything. He could see that clearly. She was just saying it out loud to someone who was there, because sometimes people needed to say things out loud and he happened to be present. You've been looking for a place, he said. Since September. Nothing in town is... The prices have gone up because of the new mill workers coming in, and what's left is either too expensive or... She stopped. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this. You came out here to tell me something, he said. She looked at him. In the cold, he said. Twice now. With no coat. She blinked. I have a coat. That's not a winter coat. It's adequate. It isn't. She stared at him, and something cracked in her expression that might have been the beginning of a laugh, except she was too tired for it to fully arrive. Are we really discussing my coat right now? I'm pointing out that you've come outside to talk to me twice, and both times you didn't dress for the weather, which suggests you came on an impulse rather than a plan. The almost laugh tried again. This time it got a little further. That's a very specific observation. I noticed things, he said. She looked at him for a moment in the cold dark. I came out here tonight because there's one more gathering, she said. Alcott announced it. Final one before winter. He asked me to let you know. He could have told me himself. He was embarrassed, she said. He didn't want to look you in the eye. And you did. I prefer to, she said. He stood in the dark looking at her and thought about 3 weeks and a building being sold and an inadequate coat and the specific look of a person who had run out of good options but hadn't yet decided what to do about it. Come to the next gathering, he said. She went very still. I wasn't asking. I know. Mr. Kane, Darius, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The cold was doing something to her breath, making it visible in small clouds between them. Eliza, she said finally. Come to the next gathering, he said again. As a participant, not as a message carrier. She looked at him as though she was trying to determine whether she'd misunderstood. Her face was hard to read, not deliberately closed, but complex in a way that suggested she'd learned not to let things land on the surface. You don't know me, she said. I know you come outside in a bad coat to tell people uncomfortable things because you think they deserve to hear them, he said. I know you've been in this valley at least a year and nobody at these gatherings talks about you the way they talk about other women. Which means you're either invisible or you've kept yourself that way. And I know you teach children for not enough money and your landlord just sold the ground from under you. He paused. That's more than I know about most people. She was quiet for a long time. I'm not... She stopped, started again. I'm not what those women in there are. I'm not... She seemed to be trying to find the right word and not finding it. I'm not what a man in your position would choose for practical reasons. What's my position? You need someone strong, she said. Someone who can handle the mountain. I'm a school teacher. I don't need strong, he said. I need someone who tells the truth. The cold settled around them. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed, and the thin sound of the fiddles from inside reached them briefly before being swallowed by the wind. Come to the gathering, he said one more time, not pressing, just saying it clearly. She pulled her coat tighter. She looked at him and then down at the dark ground between them and then back up. All right, she said. She went back inside. He stood by his horse for a moment, looking at the door. and thought that the word all right had never in his life sounded so much like the beginning of something. Then he mounted up and rode back up the mountain, and the cold came down around him, and he didn't mind it the way he usually did. The word spread by morning. That was the way of Black Hollow. Something happened in the evening, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, it had already been processed, discussed, reshaped, and distributed to every corner of the settlement. Eliza had known this when she'd walked back inside the grain hall the night before, and she'd known it when she said, "all right" in the cold, and she'd said it anyway, which was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she'd done in 2 years of living in this valley. By the time she arrived at the schoolhouse the next morning, 3 separate people had already found reasons to be on Birch Road. Martha Croft was sweeping her porch, which faced the opposite direction from Birch Road and required a specific effort to sweep toward it. She watched Eliza walk by with the expression of someone cataloging information for later use. Old Henry Sauer was sitting on the bench outside the feed store, reading a newspaper he'd been holding upside down for the last 5 minutes. And Agnes Whitmore, who had studied the floor at the first gathering rather than look at Darius Kane, was standing near the schoolhouse fence with a basket on her arm that contained nothing visible, talking to a woman Eliza didn't recognize, and both of them stopped talking when Eliza approached. "Good morning, Agnes," Eliza said. "Good morning." Agnes's voice was careful, the way it always was with Eliza. Not unfriendly, but measured, like she was keeping something in reserve. "Cold one today." "It is." A pause, loaded with something neither of them was going to acknowledge directly. "I heard," Agnes said, "that you spoke with Darius Kane last night, after the gathering." "I did," Eliza said. Agnes waited. The woman with the basket waited. The silence between them had the quality of a held breath. "He seems like a man who knows the mountain well," Eliza said, and unlocked the schoolhouse door and went inside. She sat at her desk for 3 minutes before the first student arrived, and she used those 3 minutes to press her palms flat on the desktop and breathe carefully and remind herself that she had made a practical decision based on practical circumstances, and that what other people thought about it was their business and not hers. This was easier to believe in theory than at 7 in the morning in a drafty schoolhouse with Agnes Whitmore's careful voice still in her ear. The practical circumstances were these. Eliza Hart had come to Black Hollow 2 autumns ago from a small farming community 3 days east, where her family had worked 50 acres of wheat and corn for 20 years, and the drought had taken it in 18 months. Not quickly. That was the particular cruelty of droughts. They took things slowly, incrementally, so that each season you told yourself it might turn, and each season it didn't, and by the time the reality was undeniable, there was nothing left to sell that covered what was owed. Her father had died the spring before she left, not from the drought directly, but from the accumulated weight of it, from a man who'd worked that land his whole life, watching it turn to dust, and not finding a way to carry the knowledge. Her mother had gone to live with Eliza's older brother in a settlement further north. Eliza had come west with $40, her teaching certificate, and a trunk of books, because west was where settlements needed teachers and she needed work that paid. Black Hollow had offered her a position within a week of her arriving. The pay was not generous, but it was consistent, and the children were not difficult, and she'd found a room in the boarding house on 2nd Street that was cold in winter, but manageable. And she'd told herself she was building something. What she was actually doing was surviving, and surviving at a level that left no margin for anything going wrong. When Martin Geller told her in September that he'd sold the building to a new owner who planned to convert the upper floor to storage, her first feeling was not panic, but something more like exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been waiting for the next thing to go wrong and finally has their suspicions confirmed. She'd spent 6 weeks looking for alternative housing. Everything in the valley had gone up in price with the mill expansion. The one room she could afford was in a building on the far north end of town that smelled permanently of something she couldn't identify, and whose other residents included 2 men who watched her move through the hallway in a way that made her careful about her schedule. She hadn't told anyone about any of this. This was partly pride and partly something more practical. In Black Hollow, as in most frontier settlements, a woman without visible resources was a target for a specific kind of concern that looked like sympathy but functioned more like assessment. People would want to solve her problem for her, and the solutions they offered were usually the solutions that were convenient for them. She'd watched it happen to other women. She had no intention of being watched. The problem with this approach was that it required maintaining a version of herself that was capable and settled and not particularly in need of anything, and she was getting tired of it. The night she'd followed Darius Kane outside the grain hall the second time, she'd told herself she was going out to deliver information, and that was true, but it wasn't all of it. The full truth was that she'd been sitting inside listening to the tail end of a gathering that had nothing to do with her, watching Frank Pruitt's shoulders shaking with the effort of not laughing, and she'd looked around the room at all these people she'd been living alongside for 2 years without ever quite being part of them, and she'd thought, I am so tired of this specific kind of invisible. And then she'd gone outside and said things she hadn't planned to say to a man she barely knew. She wasn't sure what that said about her judgment. She was increasingly unsure it said anything bad. What Eliza knew about Darius Kane was not what the town knew. The town knew the stories, the broken nose, the scar, the isolation, the general impression of a man who existed somewhere outside the normal boundaries of community. They knew the dramatic version, which was useful for frightening children into staying out of the high country and for filling the silence at dinner tables. What Eliza knew was what she'd seen. She'd seen him the previous January, during the 3-day cold snap that had dropped temperatures low enough to kill livestock left outside. She'd been walking home from the schoolhouse at dusk when she passed the edge of the road where it branched toward the South Valley, and she'd seen a figure in the gray light moving along the ditch. A large man carrying what appeared to be a bundle of firewood, except the bundle was too large and he was moving too steadily for it to be just wood. She'd stopped to look and realized that what he was carrying was split and bundled and organized, and he was leaving stacks of it outside doors. Not the doors of people who would see him and thank him, but the back doors, the ones facing away from the road. He left a stack at the Widow Price's back step and moved on before she could have opened the door. He left a larger stack at the Bull family's woodshed, which had been visibly depleted all week. He moved through it quickly and without any apparent desire to be seen, and Eliza had stood in the road in the cold and watched until he was out of sight. She'd asked around carefully after that. Not obviously, just listening, noting. The pattern was consistent once she knew to look for it. Repairs appeared on structures that had been damaged in storms, done at night, with no bill left and no name attached. Stranded travelers on the high road had stories about a large man who'd appeared out of the dark and helped them down to the valley. The family with the broken ankle. She'd heard that story from the wife herself, who told it the way you tell a story about something that didn't quite feel real, something that happened at the edge of exhaustion and cold that you weren't entirely sure you'd remembered correctly. Nobody in town talked about these things when they talked about Darius Kane because they didn't fit the narrative that had already been constructed, and narratives in small communities were remarkably resistant to new information. Eliza found this frustrating in a way that was, she admitted to herself, not entirely unconnected to the fact that she knew exactly what it felt like to have a narrative constructed around you that bore little resemblance to who you actually were. The third gathering fell on a Tuesday in late October, and the weather cooperated in the way weather in the valley only did grudgingly, cold but clear, the sky a hard pale blue above the mountains, and the wind coming down off the high slopes in long measured gusts, rather than the constant assault of the weeks prior. Eliza wore her better dress, which was not significantly better than her everyday dress, but had been mended more recently and was a color that suited her more than the gray one. She did her hair properly, which took longer than usual because her hands were less steady than she would have liked. She told herself she was being practical. She arrived at the grain hall at the same time as Margaret Fenwick and her mother, which meant she walked in accompanied rather than alone, which was something. The room was arranged the same way. Men on one side, women on the other, Alcott at the front with his list, the Fenwick brothers setting up their fiddles in the corner. The attendance was thinner than the first gathering. Most of the community's enthusiasm for the project had worn down to a kind of dutiful persistence. She positioned herself at the edge of the women's side and looked straight ahead. She could feel people noticing her. It was a specific sensation, not dramatic, just the slight adjustment of attention in a room when something unexpected has appeared. She'd been to both previous gatherings, but as a general attendee, not as a participant. Now she was standing in the line. Someone behind her said, not quietly enough, "Is that the school teacher?" Someone else said something she didn't catch, and there was a brief suppressed laugh. She kept her eyes forward. Alcott began the introductions, and she watched them move through the men's side with the same slightly strained cheerfulness as before. She found herself watching the door. She was not going to let herself watch the door. She watched the door anyway. He came in through the main entrance this time, which she noticed without meaning to. He was wearing the same dark wool coat as before, and he looked the same as he'd looked every time she'd seen him, large and composed and slightly out of place in a room full of people, the way a piece of outdoor furniture looks when someone's moved it inside. He scanned the room with the quick, flat efficiency of a man assessing an unfamiliar space, and then his eyes found her. He didn't nod. He didn't acknowledge her with anything visible. But the scan stopped for just a moment and then continued, and that was enough. The introductions continued. When it was Darius's turn, he said his name and his location with the same flatness as before, and Alcott asked with his strained optimism which of the women might be interested in speaking further, and this time there was a different silence. It wasn't the silence of refusal. It was the silence of people trying to determine what was happening, because Eliza was standing in the line where she hadn't been standing before, and Darius was standing at the front where he'd stood before, and the geometry of the room had a different feeling. Agnes Whitmore took a small step forward, then pulled back. It was Clara Hess who spoke first, the miller's daughter, who'd looked at the wall at the first gathering. "I'd be willing to speak with Mr. Kane," she said, in the voice of someone doing something they've reasoned themselves into rather than wanted. There was a general release of tension in the room, the kind that happens when a difficult moment appears to be resolving itself in an expected direction. Alcott smiled. "Wonderful. And her." The room went quiet. Darius had not moved from his spot, but he'd raised his right hand slightly and extended one finger, and it wasn't pointed at Clara Hess. It was pointed across the room, through the cluster of people between them, directly at Eliza. He said it again, quieter but completely clear. "Her. Only her." The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then the room erupted. Not all at once. It happened in stages, which was somehow worse. First the murmuring, quick and low, the immediate spreading of the fact through the people who hadn't seen where he was pointing. Then the louder voices, the ones that had opinions and no particular interest in keeping them private. Clara Hess's expression shifted from polite willingness to something colder. Her mother, standing 2 feet behind her, said, "Well," in a tone that contained an entire paragraph. Frank Pruitt, who was somehow here again, Eliza was beginning to suspect he had a specific interest in these gatherings that had nothing to do with settlement stability, said loudly from the back, "The teacher? Are you serious?" "Frank," Alcott said. "I'm asking a genuine question," Pruitt said. "She's—" He paused, the pause containing everything he was deciding whether or not to say out loud. "She's not. She's in no position to be setting up a household. She doesn't even have a place to live." The fact that he knew this told Eliza that news traveled faster in Black Hollow than she'd accounted for. "That's not your business," Darius said. "I'm a member of this community." "So is she." "She's been here 2 years, someone said. A woman, Eliza thought, from the direction, but she couldn't identify who without turning around. "She's never put down roots. She's not—" "She's standing right here," Eliza said. Her own voice surprised her. It came out steadier than it had any right to, given that her heart was doing something uncomfortable in her chest, and her hands were making fists in her skirt that she was trying to keep invisible. The woman who'd been speaking, it was Mary Holt, she could see now, the blacksmith's wife, looked at her with an expression that was almost embarrassed. Almost. "I just mean," Mary said more quietly, "that it seems sudden." "Most things are," Eliza said. She looked at Darius across the room. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not waiting, exactly. Not anxious. More like a man who had made his decision and was now prepared to stand in whatever came of it. She thought about her landlord. She thought about the building on the north end with the unidentifiable smell. She thought about her mother's face the last time she'd seen it, and her father's hands, and 50 acres of dried wheat. She thought about a large man leaving firewood at back doors in the dark in January. "All right," she said. Not to the room, to him. He walked across the room toward her, and the crowd parted the way crowds do when a situation has clearly passed beyond the point where anyone's preferences are going to alter it, and he stopped 2 feet from her and said very quietly, "You're sure?" "Are you?" she said. "Yes." "Then I'm sure," she said, which was more or less a lie, but also somehow the truest thing she'd said in a long time. The voices behind them were still going. Alcott was attempting to restore some procedural order to the evening, which was a lost cause. Clara Hess had turned away and was speaking to her mother in a low, tight voice. Pruitt was saying something to Jim Sauer that he wasn't bothering to lower. Darius looked at her and tilted his head slightly toward the door. She nodded. They walked out together, and the cold came down on both of them, and from inside the grain hall the sound of people talking about them followed them halfway down the road before the wind carried it off. Neither of them spoke for most of a block. Then Darius said, "The cabin has 2 rooms." "All right," she said. "It needs work," he said. "The east side of the roof. I've been putting it off. I can help with that." He looked at her sideways. "Have you done roof work?" "No," she admitted, "but I can learn." He looked ahead again, and something at the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the predecessor to one. "That coat still isn't warm enough," he said. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." She looked down at the coat and then at the mountains dark above the tree line, and she thought, "This is either the most sensible or the most insane decision I have ever made. Possibly both. Probably both." The wind came down off the peaks, cold and direct and indifferent to anyone's plans. She pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. The trunk was heavier than it looked. Eliza had packed it herself twice, once in September when she thought she'd found a room on the east side of town, and once now, 3 weeks later, standing in the boarding house on 2nd Street with the door open and Martin Geller hovering in the hallway pretending he wasn't watching to make sure she actually left. She'd fit everything she owned into it: the books, her mother's quilt, 2 dresses, her teaching materials, a small tin of her father's tools that she'd kept for no practical reason except that she couldn't make herself leave them. Darius came with the wagon at 7 in the morning. He didn't knock. He pulled up outside and waited, and when she came to the window and saw him, she thought, for the first time since saying all right, in the cold outside the grain hall, that this was a real thing that was actually happening. She carried the trunk down herself. She had to drag it down the last 3 steps because it kept catching on the railing, and she was breathing hard by the time she got it to the bottom. Darius took it from her without comment and lifted it into the wagon bed with the straightforward ease of a man for whom the weight was simply not a problem. And then he looked at the rest of what she'd brought: 2 bags, a crate of books, the tin of tools, and loaded those too. Martin Geller appeared in the doorway to watch them leave. He had the expression of a man who'd expected this to not quite happen and was recalibrating. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Geller," she said, and climbed up to the wagon seat. They rode out of town in the early morning quiet, the main street not yet busy, the mountains ahead of them catching the first pale light. Eliza sat with her hands in her lap and watched Black Hollow get smaller behind them and tried to take inventory of what she was feeling, which turned out to be too complicated to inventory. They were a mile out before either of them spoke. "How long to the cabin?" she said. 2 hours if the road's clear. More if it's not." She looked at the sky. "It'll be clear today." "Probably," he said. The road climbed steadily, leaving the valley floor and beginning to push up through the lower pine stands, the air getting colder and cleaner with every quarter mile. Eliza had seen the mountain from below for 2 years, but had never actually gone up it, and the experience was different from what she'd expected. It was less dramatic close up than it appeared from the valley. The slope was gradual at first, the trees dense and quiet, the road a worn track between them that looked like it had been made by someone who didn't particularly care whether others followed it. "You built the road yourself," she said. "Widened it," he said. "It was a game trail when I got here." She looked at the width of it, just enough for the wagon, the trees close on both sides. "How did you get building materials up?" "Slowly," he said. She almost laughed. It came out as a small exhale instead. They went up in silence for a while. The pines gave way to sparser growth at the higher elevation, and then to open stretches where the mountain fell away below them and the valley spread out in long, pale bands of field and frost. She could see the line of Black Hollow from here, the church spire, the grain hall roof, the thin thread of smoke from the mill, and it looked smaller than it felt from inside it. People are going to talk, she said. They already are. I mean for a long time, not just this week. He glanced at her. Does that change anything? She considered it honestly. No, she said. But I want you to know I'm aware of it. I'm not walking into this without understanding what it looks like. What does it look like? Like a desperate woman and a man people don't trust making a bad decision together, she said. That's what they'll say. He was quiet for a moment. The horse found its footing on a rocky section of road, and they jolted slightly, and he steadied the reins without appearing to think about it. What do you say? He asked. She looked at the mountain above them, the higher slopes gray and bare against the pale sky, the line of the summit clear today in a way it wasn't always. I say I've been making careful decisions for 2 years, she said, and I'm still a month away from sleeping in a building that smells like something died in the walls. He didn't say anything to that, but the corner of his mouth moved again in that way it did. Not quite a smile, but the shape that preceded one. The cabin was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she'd expected. It was larger than the image she'd constructed. 2 rooms, as he'd told her, but each room was a real room rather than the cramped quarters she'd imagined. The main room had a fireplace on the north wall and a wood stove against the east, a table he'd built himself from rough-cut lumber that was not elegant but was solid, 2 chairs, shelves of dry stores and tools and books. More books than she'd anticipated, their spines worn and their covers warped from the altitude. The second room was smaller, a sleeping room with a frame bed and a chest and a window that faced west toward the valley. He stopped at the door of the second room and said, "This is yours." She looked at the room, then at him. "And you." "Main room," he said. "I sleep better near the fire anyway." She didn't argue with this, partly because it was practically sensible, and partly because she could tell it wasn't negotiable, and she respected that he'd made the decision and stated it plainly rather than making her navigate around it. "The east roof section," she said. "You mentioned it needs work. It can wait until tomorrow." "Show me today," she said, "so I know what I'm dealing with." He looked at her for a moment, the same way he'd looked at her outside the grain hall, trying to determine what she actually was. Then he took her around the outside of the cabin and pointed up at the section where 2 roof planes met, where the boards had pulled apart at the seam and would let in water, and eventually snow, if not addressed before the hard weather arrived. "I need to pull those boards and relay them," he said, "and pack the gap with something that won't crack in the freeze. Can I help, or would I be in the way?" "Depends," he said. "Are you afraid of heights?" She looked at the roof line. It was not a tall building. "No," she said. "Then you can help." She thought she'd passed some kind of test, though she wasn't certain what it was. They worked on the roof the next day and the day after that. It was not pleasant work. The boards were stubborn, and the cold made everything take twice as long. And on the second afternoon, the wind came up and they had to stop earlier than planned. Eliza's hands were clumsy with the cold, even through her gloves, and she dropped a hammer once and almost dropped it again. And Darius said nothing about either instance, just handed things back when they needed to be handed back, and worked at the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had long ago accepted that the mountain set the schedule, not the other way around. She noticed, over these first days, how he moved through the cabin and around the property. The economy of it, nothing wasted, everything purposeful. He cooked with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything else, producing food that was plain and filling without any apparent interest in whether it was enjoyable. And when she offered to cook on the second evening, he looked at her as though the possibility hadn't occurred to him. "You don't have to," he said. "I want to," she said. "I'm better at it than you are." He thought about this. "You've had 1 meal here." "Yes," she said. "That's how I know." He moved away from the stove without arguing. She was not, in fact, a significantly better cook than him. She was a competent cook with limited materials, which was the same as him, but she used the spices he kept on the high shelf that she suspected he'd forgotten were there, and the result was different enough that he ate it in a particular silence that suggested he was processing the difference. "Salt was too much," she said. "It was fine. You pushed it to the side. I was just... He stopped, looked at his plate. The salt was slightly too much, he said. She laughed. It surprised her. The laugh came up without warning, genuine and a little too loud for the size of the room. He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between startled and uncertain, and then something in his face loosened by a fraction. I'll get it right next time, she said. I'll eat it either way, he said, which was not a compliment exactly, but was, she thought, as close as he knew how to get in the first week of knowing someone. Black Hollow did not leave them alone. She'd known it wouldn't, but the specific shape of the intrusion surprised her. It came first in the form of concern, which was the form most intrusions took before they became what they actually were. Alcott rode up on the 8th day, his gray mare looking even less enthusiastic about the altitude than usual, and he sat at the table and drank coffee and said he wanted to be sure Eliza was all right, that the arrangement was what she wanted, that nobody had pressured her into anything. Nobody pressured me, she said. Of course not, he said, in the tone of a man who'd prepared for her to say this and had a follow-up ready. I just want to make sure you have options. The settlement has there's a fund for community members in need of... I have what I need, she said. Alcott looked at Darius, who was sitting across the room, resetting a hinge on the door to the supply shelf, and had not looked up during this exchange. Darius, Alcott said. She said she has what she needs, Darius said without looking up. Alcott stayed another 20 minutes, drinking his coffee and making the conversation of a man buying time while deciding whether to say the thing he'd actually come to say. Eventually he said it. There were people in town who were worried. Some of the families felt that Eliza had made a hasty decision under financial strain, and would they consider coming to a community meeting to address the questions people had? What questions? Darius said. Just concerns. People want to understand the situation. The situation is that she moved to the mountain, Darius said. There's nothing to understand. What people feel isn't the same as what people need, Darius said. He set down the hinge and looked at Alcott directly. If there's a real problem, something that affects the community, something that needs addressing, I'll come down. If it's a meeting so people can say what they think about a decision that's none of their business, I won't. Alcott left without a clear answer. The second intrusion came 3 days later and was less polite. Frank Pruitt and Jim Sauer rode up in the mid-afternoon, which told Eliza they'd timed it for when they thought Darius might be out on the trap lines. He wasn't. He'd come back early because of the weather, but he was in the side yard splitting wood and didn't hear them until they'd already knocked. Eliza opened the door. Pruitt looked past her into the cabin with the comfortable authority of a man who'd never had reason to question his welcome anywhere. Miss Hart, he said, just checking in. Mr. Pruitt, she said, wanted to see how you were getting on up here. He said it pleasantly, but there was something underneath it, a particular quality of attention, like he was cataloging details. Alcott tells us you've settled in. I have. He tilted his head slightly, looking at the room behind her. You know, there are people in town who feel a responsibility to you. You've been teaching their children. That builds a kind of connection. I appreciate that, she said. Clara Hess especially, he said. She was put in an uncomfortable position the other night, and her family feels... I didn't put Clara in any position, Eliza said. Pruitt's pleasant expression held, but something behind his eyes tightened. Nobody's saying you did. I'm just explaining that people have feelings about how things went. And there are those who think it might be better for everyone if you came back to town. Settled things properly. We could find you a room, something more... More what? Eliza said. He opened his mouth. More appropriate, she said. More visible? More convenient for the people who want to form opinions about what I should be doing? Pruitt looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating who he was dealing with. Behind her, from the side yard, came the sound of boots on the step, and then Darius was in the doorway behind her, still holding the splitting maul, not aggressively, just holding it the way you hold a tool when you've been interrupted in the middle of using it. Pruitt, he said. Kane. Pruitt's voice shifted register. We were just checking on Miss Hart. She's fine, Darius said. Road down is still clear. You've got about 2 hours of light. It was not a threat. It was purely factual information about travel conditions. But the delivery made the meaning clear enough, and Pruitt and Sauer looked at each other with the look of men deciding whether to push a situation and deciding not to. "We'll be going then," Pruitt said. They rode down. Eliza stood in the doorway and watched them until the tree line took them, and then she went back inside and sat down at the table and pressed her hands flat on its surface, the way she'd done at her desk after Agnes Whitmore's careful questions, and she breathed. Darius came inside and set them all by the door and looked at her. "He'll be back," she said. "Probably," Darius said. "He doesn't like that he can't fix this situation in a direction that suits him." "No," Darius agreed. She looked at her hands on the table. "I didn't need you to come in." "I know," he said. "I'd finished splitting." She looked up at him. "That's a lie." The corner of his mouth. Slight exaggeration. "Thank you," she said. Not for the rescue. She hadn't needed rescuing, and they both understood that, just for the presence, for the fact of someone being on the same side of the door. He nodded once, crossed to the stove, and started building up the fire for the evening. The nights were the hardest part to navigate. Not in the way the town's imagination would have constructed it. That was its own separate conversation that neither of them had yet had directly, though the understanding was present in the room the way cold air is present in a building even after you've lit the fires. The nights were hard because the mountain got very quiet after dark, and quiet had a way of surfacing things that daylight and work kept at a manageable distance. She'd hear him in the main room sometimes. The shift of weight, the brief sound of a book being opened, the occasional scrape of the chair. He slept badly. She'd known this within 2 days from the pattern of sounds, the way the fire was always built back up by the time she woke in the morning. On the 12th night she came out of the second room because she couldn't sleep and found him sitting at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold and a book open to a page he'd clearly not been reading. He looked up when she came out. "Can't sleep either," she said, not a question. "Rarely," he said. She got herself water and sat down across from him, and they sat in the quiet for a while in the way you can only sit with someone once the first 2 weeks of living alongside them have stripped away the particular anxiety of proximity. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "Why did you point at me?" she said. "At the gathering, specifically me." He looked at the cold coffee cup. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "You came outside," he said. "Twice. In that coat." "You said that before." "It's the actual answer," he said. "Most people—" He stopped, turned the cup slightly on the table. "Most people in that town have decided what I am. They decided a long time ago, and they're not particularly interested in revising it. But you came outside and said that was unkind, and then looked me in the eye and let me go. You didn't need anything from it. You just thought it should be said." She looked at him. "That's a person I'd want to know," he said. Simple as that. Outside, the wind moved through the pines above the cabin, and the fire ticked and settled, and the mountain did what the mountain always did. It kept its own counsel, indifferent to whatever small human negotiations were being worked out beneath it. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions about everything, and I say them." "I've noticed," he said, "and I'm not strong the way this mountain requires. I'm going to struggle with things." "I've noticed that too," he said. "You do them anyway." She looked at the table. "We might be making a terrible mistake." "We might," he agreed. He didn't say anything to soften it. She appreciated that more than she could have easily explained. "All right," she said, and got up to go back to bed. "Eliza." She stopped. "The coat situation needs to be resolved before the real snow comes," he said. She stood in the doorway of the second room and laughed, genuinely, fully, in the dark of the mountain cabin with the wind outside and Black Hollow invisible far below. "Go to sleep, Darius," she said. He picked up his book. Neither of them slept much, but the quiet between them had changed its quality. Less like an absence and more like something being built, rough and unfinished, and nothing like perfect, the way everything real is. The first real snow came on a Thursday. Not the tentative early-season dusting that had been falling on and off since the second week of November. Those were just the mountain testing itself, shaking loose whatever hadn't been secured. This was different. Darius felt it coming 2 days before it arrived, in the specific quality of the air pressure and the behavior of the animals, and the particular silence that settled over the high country when the atmosphere was organizing itself for something serious. He'd spent those 2 days finishing things. The wood stores topped off, the animals secured, the roof checked one more time, the supply shelves reorganized so that what they'd need most was at the front. Eliza had watched all of this without asking questions, which he was beginning to understand was one of her specific qualities. She observed first and spoke second, and the things she said after observing were generally useful. She helped where he directed her and didn't insert herself where she'd be in the way, and by the end of the second day she'd started anticipating the next task without being told, which surprised him more than he let on. "It's going to be bad," she said on the evening before it hit, standing at the west window watching the sky close down over the valley. "Yes," he said. "How long?" "Can't know. 3 days at least. Could be more." She was quiet for a moment. "The Valley families. The ones on the South Road. The Bowles, the Prices. They're not well stocked." He looked at her. "I know that's not our immediate problem," she said. "I'm just noting it." "I know which families are understocked," he said. He'd been noting it since September, the same way he noted everything about Black Hollow from a distance, not as a member of the community, but as someone who paid attention to conditions. "There's nothing to be done once it's on us. The time was before." "Did you try to tell anyone?" He was quiet. "Darius?" "I mentioned it to McCready in October," he said. "He said the settlement committee had it handled." She turned from the window. "Did they?" "Probably not," he said. She turned back to the window and looked at the sky, and he could see her thinking, not spiraling, just working through it the way she worked through things, methodically and without drama. "All right," she said. "Then we deal with it when the storm breaks." The storm broke on the 4th day. Those 4 days were not easy. The wind hit the cabin like something personal, finding every small gap they hadn't sealed, dropping the internal temperature despite both fires burning through the night. On the 2nd day, a section of the pine stand to the north came down under the snow weight, and one of the trees clipped the corner of the supply shed, damaging the wall enough that Darius had to go out in the storm and brace it from inside before they lost the stored meat. He came back in covered in ice from the waist up, his hands barely functional, and Eliza got the fire built up and put water on and said absolutely nothing about the state of him, just handed him dry clothes and moved out of the way. He appreciated the lack of commentary more than he could have expressed. On the 3rd night, she woke to find him sitting at the table again, but this time he wasn't reading. He was looking at a rough map he'd drawn of the valley, the roads, the homesteads, the creek lines. She sat down across from him, and he didn't explain what he was doing, and she looked at the map and understood it without explanation. "The creek will have gone over the South Bank Road," she said. "Probably, which cuts off the Bowles and the 3 families further down. And the Holt place is on low ground. 2 feet of standing snow on low ground is a foot of water when it starts to melt," he said, "if the drainage is blocked." She studied the map. "The schoolhouse has emergency stores. I helped Alcott inventory them in September. There were blankets, some dry goods, a medical kit." He looked at her. "You know where the key is?" "I know where Alcott keeps it," she said, in the tone of a person who knows where a lot of things are, because she pays attention to the details that other people consider beneath their notice. They sat with the map for another hour. It wasn't a plan so much as the shape of a plan, the order in which things needed to happen, the places where the greatest need would be, the resources they had against the resources they'd need. "It's going to be ugly," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you going anyway?" He looked at her. "Are you asking if you can come?" "I'm asking if you're going to try to stop me." The fire ticked in the silence. "No," he said. "Then we should sleep," she said. "We'll need it." They went down at first light on the 4th day when the snow had stopped and the wind had dropped to something manageable, and the mountain looked like something out of a story, enormous and white, and completely indifferent to the fact that human beings were trying to move across it. The going was slow. The horse couldn't push through the depth of it in places, and they ended up going on foot for significant stretches, Darius breaking trail and Eliza following in his footsteps because the snow was thigh-deep in the drifted sections, and she didn't have the body weight to punch through it the way he could. She didn't complain about this. She just kept moving, which was its own kind of demanding. The first homestead they reached was the Bowl place, 40 minutes below the cabin. Hannah Bowl came to the door with the expression of someone who had been managing fear alone for 3 days and was nearly done managing it. Inside, her husband was down with something respiratory that had worsened in the cold, and their woodpile was almost gone. "I can get you more wood," Darius said. "There's a standing deadfall on the east slope that I've been leaving as emergency supply, but it'll take time." "The children," Hannah said, looking at Eliza. "I'll stay with them while he gets the wood," Eliza said. "Is there anything else in the house? Food? Medicine?" Hannah's face did something complicated. She'd been at the grain haul. She'd watched Darius point across the room. She'd probably said things afterward in the way all of them had. "I have broth on," she said after a moment, "if you want to come in." They stayed 2 hours at the Bowls. Darius cut and hauled wood while Eliza helped Hannah get her husband into the warmer room and fed the children and went through the medical kit she'd brought from the cabin with the focused practicality of a woman who had, in a previous life, cared for people through illness on a farm where the nearest doctor was 2 days away. When they left, Hannah Bowl caught Eliza's sleeve at the door. "Miss Hart," she said, then stopped. "We'll check back in 2 days," Eliza said. "Make sure the wood holds." They moved on. The South Road was worse than Darius had mapped it. Not just the creek over the bank, but a section of the road that had gone entirely, the ground beneath it undercut by water running under the snowpack. He stood at the edge of it and looked at the gap and calculated, and the calculation was not good. "The Croft family is on the other side of this," Eliza said. "Yes." "And the Miller family?" "Yes." She looked at the gap. It was maybe 12 feet across, the ground on the far side lower and uncertain. "Can we go around?" "Through the tree stand to the east," he said. "Takes longer, maybe an hour." "Then we go east," she said. They went east. The Miller place was the one that broke the shape of the day into something different. They heard the child before they saw the house, a sound carried on the open air that was not crying exactly, but was the sound a child makes when they've been frightened past the point of normal crying, and have come out the other side into something quieter and more alarming. Darius was moving before Eliza had fully registered what she'd heard, and she pushed herself faster through the snow behind him and arrived at the Miller cabin 30 seconds after he did. The door was open. Inside, Clara Miller, 8 years old, one of Eliza's students, was sitting on the floor with her 2-year-old brother in her lap, and the fire was completely out. And the temperature inside the cabin was barely above the temperature outside. "Where are your parents?" Eliza said, going to the children immediately. "Mama went to the Croft place 2 days ago," Clara said. Her voice had the flat quality of shock. "She said she'd be back before night. She didn't come back." "And your father?" "He went to find her yesterday morning." She looked up at Eliza with the face of a child who has been holding a situation together by sheer will and is near the end of her ability to do it. "I couldn't get the fire to start. I kept trying." Eliza took the 2-year-old from her arms. The baby was cold, but not dangerously cold. Clara had been holding him against her body, and that had been enough, barely. Eliza held him close and looked at Darius. He was already at the fireplace. He had fire going in 4 minutes, which was not fast by ordinary standards, but was close to a physical record given the state of the wood and the cold of the chimney draw. He did it without showing the urgency in his hands, which Eliza noticed and which told her something about the kind of person he was. Someone who had learned that panic in a frightening situation transferred directly to the frightened people watching you. "The Croft place is half a mile north," he said, without turning from the fire. "If her mother went there—" "I know the way," Eliza said. "I can go." He turned then. "In what?" "I'll manage," she said. "The snowpack on the north side of the ridge is unstable," he said. "I've been watching it since Tuesday. If you go north above the tree line, then I won't go above the tree line," she said. They looked at each other across the small, warming room, over the heads of 2 children, and she watched him weigh it, the risk to her against the risk of leaving the Millers' parents unfound. "Stay below the rock formation on the east face," he said. "Don't cross onto the open slope." All right. If the snow changes sound, if it starts to sound hollow under your feet, stop moving and come back. All right. He crossed the room and looked at her directly, close enough that she could see the concern in his face that he was making no particular effort to hide. I mean it, he said. I know you do, she said. Stay with the children. She went. The half-mile north took 40 minutes in the conditions. Eliza kept to the trees as he'd told her, following the line of the east face and staying well clear of the open slope where the snowpack had the wrong quality. A brittle crust over something looser underneath that she could hear shifting slightly when she put her weight near it. She was breathing hard, and her legs were screaming by the time the Croft place came into view, and through the window she could see firelight and the shapes of people inside. She knocked, and Sarah Miller opened the door with the face of a woman who'd been trying to get home for 2 days. Your children are all right, Eliza said, before anything else. Clara kept her brother warm. They're both all right. Sarah Miller made a sound that was not quite speech and grabbed the door frame. Inside, there were 7 people in the Croft cabin. The Crofts themselves, Sarah Miller, her husband who'd come looking for her and found the same problem she had, and 2 travelers who'd been on the road when the storm hit and had made for the nearest light. The road between the 2 cabins had become impassable in the second day. Not just deep snow, but a fallen tree that had brought down a section of fence and blocked the path entirely. We need to clear a road back, Eliza said to the room. We need to get you all consolidated somewhere defensible while the snowmelt starts. The South Bank Road is out, which means your best option is the schoolhouse in town as a staging point, or up. Up? Said one of the travelers, a young man with a red beard and frostbitten ears. You mean the mountain? There's a cabin up there with wood, food, and a working roof, she said. It's higher elevation, but the cabin is solid. The man who built it knows what he's doing. She could see the calculation in the room. These people, most of whom had been at the gathering, working through the geography of what she was proposing. Kane's place, Tom Croft said. Yes, Eliza said. A pause. My daughter's feet are bad, Tom Croft said. Chilblains. I don't know if she can make the climb. Then we carry her, Eliza said. Let's get the tree off the road first. But they came back down to the Miller cabin in a group of 9, 7 adults, and 2 additional children from the Croft family, plus Clara and her brother, plus Eliza, moving in a ragged line through the snow. Tom Croft and his older son had freed the fallen tree in an hour of hard work, and the road between the 2 properties was passable, barely. They arrived to find Darius standing in the Miller cabin doorway, watching their approach, the 2 Miller children visible behind him, both of them with color in their faces again. He looked at the group, and then at Eliza, and said nothing for a moment. I told them the cabin had room, she said. He looked at the 9 people standing in the snow in front of him. It doesn't really, he said. It will, she said. For now. He looked at Tom Croft's youngest daughter, who was being carried by her father. He looked at the travelers with the frostbitten ears. He looked at Sarah Miller, who was holding her 2-year-old against her chest and had the face of a woman who had been through 3 days she did not plan to describe to anyone for a long time. All right, he said. Come in. The cabin held 12 people for 3 days, which was not comfortable by any definition of the word. It was managed discomfort rather than misery, which was a distinction that mattered. Darius controlled the fire situation with the kind of precision that only comes from years of understanding a specific space and its heat losses, and Eliza organized the food into a rotation that was monotonous but sufficient. And the children, there were 4 of them now, ranging from 2 to 8, occupied the second room in a pile of blankets that was warmer than any individual sleeping arrangement would have been. The adults slept in shifts near the fires. Conversation happened in the way it happens when people are kept in close quarters long enough, the initial stiffness wearing down, then breaking entirely. It was Tom Croft who said it first, on the second evening, sitting across from Darius with a cup of coffee that was more hot water than coffee because the supply was running low. I owe you an apology, he said. Darius looked at him. The gathering, Croft said. I wasn't one of the ones laughing, but I didn't say anything either, which is the same thing. The room had gone quiet in the particular way that rooms do when someone says something true that everyone heard. "You don't owe me an apology," Darius said. "I think I do," Croft said. "My wife thinks I do. My wife is usually right about these things." Darius looked at his own cup. "Then accept it," he said after a moment, "and let it be done." Croft nodded. "Fair enough." From the second room came the sound of Clara Miller telling her little brother a story in a low, steady voice, some invention of her own about a horse that could walk on clouds. The fire ticked. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and the mountain held all of them in its particular silence, the kind that asks nothing and offers nothing except the basic fact of shelter. On the third day, the temperature rose enough that travel became possible, and they brought everyone down to Black Hollow in 2 trips with the wagon. The roads were bad but passable. The valley looked flattened and gray, the settlement smaller than usual under the weight of the week. Alcott met them at the edge of town, and behind him were others, people who'd come out when someone spotted the wagon coming down the mountain. Clara Miller's mother had gotten ahead on foot to say the children were coming, and so there were people waiting, and the faces in that crowd were not the same faces that had been in the grain hall. Frank Pruitt was there. He was standing at the back, and when Darius climbed down from the wagon seat, he looked at him from across the distance and then looked away. And Eliza, watching from the wagon, thought that was probably the most complicated thing Pruitt would do all year. Alcott came to Darius with his hand out. Darius shook it. "How many are accounted for?" he said, because there were still families on the map whose status he didn't know. "The Henderson place lost their barn," Alcott said. "The family's fine. The Ray family, Thomas Ray and his wife, they're all right. They sheltered with the Hesses. Everyone's accounted for except Jim Sauer's older brother, who lives alone near the high ridge." Darius's jaw tightened. He knew the location. Remote, bad exposure. "I'll go up tomorrow," he said. "I'll go with you," Eliza said from behind him. Alcott looked at them both. These 2 people standing in the cold mud at the edge of Black Hollow, neither of them looking particularly triumphant, both of them looking tired, and like people who still had things left to do. "You should rest first," Alcott said. "Tomorrow," Darius said. "Tonight we rest." He turned and helped Tom Croft's youngest daughter down from the wagon, setting her carefully on the ground, and the girl held his hand for a moment because children do that with people who have helped them when they needed it, without the adult complication of pride or accounting. He let her hold it. Eliza stood beside him and watched Black Hollow come out of its own storm, people moving toward the wagon, toward the Croft children, toward each other. And she felt something that she didn't have a clean word for. Not victory, not vindication, something quieter and less satisfying and more real than either of those. They'd done what needed doing because it needed doing, that was all, and it was enough. Jim Sauer's older brother was alive. They found him on the second day, not the morning after they came down from the mountain as planned, because Eliza had slept 14 hours straight and Darius had let her, which was the closest thing to tenderness he knew how to offer without naming it. They went up at first light the following day instead, just the 2 of them on horseback, following the High Ridge Trail to the remote property where Edmund Sauer had lived alone for 11 years by his own deliberate choice. He was in worse shape than they'd hoped, and better shape than they'd feared. He'd lost 2 of his goats to the cold, and his water supply had frozen solid on the second day of the storm, and he'd been eating snow off the windowsill for hydration, which was not a good system. But he was upright when they arrived, and he looked at them through the cracked door with the specific expression of a man who has been alone long enough that visitors of any kind require a moment of adjustment. "Kane," he said, then looked at Eliza. "Who's this?" "Eliza Hart," she said. "I teach at the schoolhouse." Edmund looked her over with the unhurried assessment of a man who'd spent too long alone to bother with social performance. "You came up here voluntarily." "Yes." "In this." He gestured at the snow. "We brought water and food," she said. "Are you going to let us in, or would you prefer to keep discussing my decision-making?" Edmund Sauer opened the door. They spent 3 hours at his cabin, getting his water situation sorted and his food stores assessed, and the worst gaps in his wall insulation packed with material Darius had brought up specifically for that purpose. Edmund watched Eliza work with the expression of a man updating a file he'd thought was closed. When they were ready to leave, he stood in the doorway and said to Darius, People in town saying things about you too. People in town say things about everything, Darius said. They're saying them less now, Edmund said. He said it without emphasis, as a simple observation, and went back inside. But the ride down was quieter than the ride up. The sky had cleared completely in the way mountain skies do after heavy weather. A blue so deep and cold it looked like something solid, the kind of sky that made the world below it seem temporary and small. Eliza rode slightly behind Darius on the trail where it narrowed, and she watched his back and thought about Edmund Sauer's face when she'd told him to let them in or keep talking, and about the fact that somewhere in the last 6 weeks she'd become a person who said things like that without planning to. The mountain had done something to her, or maybe she'd done something on the mountain. She wasn't sure the distinction was as clean as she'd once have wanted it to be. "What are you thinking?" Darius said without turning. "That I should write to my mother," she said. "I haven't in 2 months." He was quiet for a moment. "What will you tell her?" Eliza considered this with genuine effort. What do you tell a woman who watched her family's life collapse under drought, whose daughter left with $40 and a trunk of books, about what that daughter has ended up doing and who she has ended up doing it with? "The truth," she said, "that I'm all right, that I'm more all right than I was." He nodded, looking ahead down the trail. "She'll want to know about you," Eliza said. "What will you tell her?" "That you're stubborn," she said, "and that you notice things other people don't, and that you can't cook properly without supervision." She paused. "And that you're the reason I have a place to be." The trail widened, and she came up alongside him, and she could see from the side that he was looking at the valley below with the particular stillness he got when something had landed that he was deciding what to do with. "That's a generous accounting," he said. "It's an accurate one," she said. They rode the rest of the way down without speaking, which by now was not a silence that required filling. Black Hollow in the weeks after the storm was a different animal from Black Hollow before it. Not transformed. That would be too clean a word for what actually happened, which was messier and more gradual and involved some people changing considerably and others changing very little, and the whole community having to find a new way to arrange itself around the updated information it now had about its own members. That's not transformation. That's just the slow, difficult work of revision, which is the only kind of change that actually sticks. The practical needs of the recovery kept everyone busy enough that the social rearrangements happened in the margins at first, in brief exchanges, in the way people positioned themselves in rooms, in what got said, and what got left unsaid. Eliza noticed these things because she noticed everything, and she noticed that the noticing was different now. People looked at her directly when they spoke to her. Not all of them, and not always, but enough that the difference was real. She was still the school teacher. She still walked up Birch Road in the mornings and unlocked the same door and stood in front of the same group of children. But the weight of invisibility that had sat on her since she'd arrived in this valley had shifted. She couldn't have said when exactly it had moved or what had moved it. She suspected it wasn't one thing. She suspected it was the accumulated weight of a storm and a decision, and 12 people in a mountain cabin eating monotonous food and sleeping in shifts and coming down together when it was over. You can't share a floor with someone for 3 days without it changing the way you see them. That worked in both directions. Clara Miller drew a picture and brought it to school on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the storm. A crayon rendering of a cabin on a mountain with 2 figures standing outside it, one very large and one smaller. She put it on Eliza's desk without comment, the way children offer things when they mean something they don't have words for yet. Eliza kept it. The community meeting happened in late January, and unlike the previous invitations to community meetings, this one was called by Alcott for an explicit purpose: to formally address the settlement's emergency response and to discuss changes to winter preparedness for the following year. Darius came down for it. He sat at the back of the grain hall, the same grain hall, the same room, 2 months after the gathering that had defined the way Black Hollow thought about him. And he listened to Alcott lead the group through an accounting of what had happened during the storm, which families had been cut off and for how long, what had failed and what had held. It was a practical meeting, focused on the concrete and the useful, and Darius found he could sit through it without the specific tension that had lived in his shoulders every other time he'd been in this building. Eliza was near the front, because Eliza had things to say about winter preparedness that were specific and useful, and she said them clearly, and people listened. She'd spent the previous week putting together a written inventory of the settlement's emergency resources and their locations. A teacher's instinct, organizing information into something that could be used, and she'd left copies on every porch along the main street the morning before the meeting. When Alcott asked if anyone had concerns about the current distribution of emergency supplies, it was Hannah Bowl who spoke first. "I want to say something that isn't about supplies," Hannah said. The room waited. "We owe these two people a debt that we won't be able to pay back with a meeting," she said. She didn't look at Darius directly. She was looking at the front of the room, at the middle distance. I'm not saying it as a performance. I'm saying it because my husband is walking around alive right now, partly because of what they did, and I didn't want to let this meeting happen without saying that out loud." A silence. Tom Croft said, "Same." Margaret Fenwick said, "Same." Sarah Miller, sitting with her two children on her lap, nodded once without speaking. From the back, Frank Pruitt said nothing. He was there, and he was listening, and that was its own kind of statement. Eliza had stopped expecting more from Frank Pruitt than he was capable of giving, which had required a specific internal adjustment that she thought of as a kind of maturity she hadn't entirely wanted to acquire. Some people didn't revise. That was a fact about people, not a verdict on the effort it took to accept the fact. Darius looked at the floor when Hannah spoke. He didn't respond to the acknowledgments, didn't stand up and say anything. Eliza watched him from the front of the room and understood, in the specific way you understand things about a person after you've lived alongside them through a hard season, that what he was feeling was not pride or vindication, but something more uncomfortable, the particular exposure of being seen by people who had previously been committed to not seeing you. That's not a comfortable thing to receive, even when it's offered honestly. She caught his eye from across the room. He looked at her for a moment, then back at his hands. She thought, he'll need time with this. And that was all right. Time was something they had. March arrived the way March always arrived at that elevation. Not warmly, not gently, but with the grudging, incremental retreat of cold that the mountain permitted when it decided the season had run its course. The snow at the high cabin was still knee-deep in the shaded areas by the third week, but the south-facing slopes had begun to show ground again, brown and compressed, and carrying the specific smell of things that had been buried for months beginning to breathe. Eliza planted the first seeds in the cabin's south-facing window box on a Thursday morning, which was an optimistic act given the temperature, but she was feeling optimistic in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She was feeling it in the more durable sense, the kind that comes not from circumstances being easy, but from knowing you can manage when they're not. She'd written to her mother in February. The letter had taken 3 days to compose and 2 complete restarts, and in the end she'd told the truth. The drought had taken their land, but it hadn't taken her, and she'd found work and a place and a person who was difficult to describe but worth the difficulty. And she was more herself than she'd been in 2 years. Her mother had written back in less than 2 weeks, faster than the mail usually moved, and the letter had said, "I'm glad. I was worried about the invisible kind of alone." She'd read that line 3 times. She'd meant to show it to Darius and hadn't yet. And she thought she probably would eventually, on some evening when the moment was right, because it said something she'd been trying to find words for since October. He was outside when she finished with the seeds, working on the south fence that had come down under the snow weight in 2 places. She could hear the sound of it, the hammer, the periodic pause, the hammer again, through the open window, that steady rhythm that had become one of the background sounds of her life, the way sounds become when you live somewhere long enough. She put the kettle on and went to the door. "Coffee?" she called. The hammering stopped. 20 minutes, he called back. "It'll be cold in 20 minutes. Then I'll drink it cold." She looked out at him, large and unhurried in the spring mud, the fence boards lined up on the ground beside him, the mountains running white and endless at his back. And she thought about Frank Pruitt's voice saying arithmetic like it was a verdict, and about the floor and the wall and the carefully studied hands, and about an inadequate coat in the cold outside the grain hall. She thought about her father's hands and 50 acres of dried wheat. She thought about her mother's line about the invisible kind of alone. She thought, You can travel a very long way to find out that what you needed was not a direction, but a person. The spring gathering was nothing like the winter ones. Alcott organized it for the practical purposes of the new season. Planting coordination, road repair schedules, the collective work that frontier settlements ran on. But it had the feeling of something else layered underneath it, the way occasions sometimes accumulate meaning beyond their stated purpose. Darius and Eliza came down together. They arrived in the wagon as they'd come down after the storm, and when they walked into the hall, through the main entrance, not the side door, the room received them differently than it ever had before. Not with celebration exactly, not with the particular performed warmth that gets extended to people who've done something heroic and therefore need to be displayed. Just with the easy adjustment of a room making space for people who belong in it. That was, Eliza thought, exactly the right amount. Ruth Lander found her near the coffee table within 5 minutes of their arrival. Ruth, who had told Darius honestly at the second gathering that her problem was not him, but the mountain. She was carrying a baby that had been born in the late fall, another reason she hadn't been at the winter gatherings. And she looked at Eliza with the directness she'd shown in the grain hall. "You stayed up there through all of it," Ruth said. "Yes," Eliza said. Ruth looked at her steadily. "Wasn't what you expected, I imagine." "No," Eliza said. "It was harder and better than I expected. Those two things can apparently be the same thing." Ruth smiled. A small, real one. "I'm figuring that out myself," she said, and shifted the baby to her other arm, and moved on. Across the room, Eliza could see Darius talking to Tom Croft. Not comfortably, exactly. Darius was never entirely comfortable in a room full of people, and she didn't expect that to change. It was simply a fact about him, like his bad sleep and his excessive competence and his inability to leave a damaged thing unfixed. But he was talking, and Tom Croft was talking back, and neither of them was watching the door. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. Frank Pruitt walked past at one point and made eye contact with Darius for a brief, charged moment. Darius held it without looking away. Pruitt nodded. Once. Minimal. The smallest possible acknowledgement that required no words and committed to nothing. Darius returned it. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was two men in the same room reaching a silent agreement that the weight between them could be set down without being resolved, which is the only realistic version of peace that most human situations actually allow. Eliza watched it happen from across the room and thought, that's real. That's what it actually looks like, not the version you'd write if you were making things up. Alcott found them both near the end of the evening, when the gathering had shifted into the relaxed, unfocused conversation of people who've finished the business and aren't quite ready to go home. He had the expression of a man who'd been carrying something he'd been looking for the right moment to set down. "I owe you both an apology," he said. "I organized those gatherings, and I didn't protect either of you well enough from what happened. I thought if I could just get people in the same room—" "You were trying to do something useful," Eliza said. "I was trying to do something useful badly," Alcott said. "Most useful things get done badly at first," Darius said. "That's not a reason not to do them." Alcott looked at him. "That's a generous way to see it." "It's a practical way," Darius said. "Generous would cost me something." Alcott laughed. A genuine one, surprised out of him. It was the kind of laugh that resets something. They talked for another few minutes about the spring planting schedule, about the road repair that needed organizing, about the families still recovering from the storm damage. Practical things. The texture of a community doing the constant work of sustaining itself. When Alcott moved on, Eliza stood with Darius at the edge of the room and watched the hall. The Fenwick brothers starting up something slow, and the children still awake past their normal hour, and Hannibal's husband laughing at something with his wife, and the whole imperfect, functional, persistently human arrangement of a settlement that had made it through a hard winter and was trying to figure out how to be something better than what it had been before. "Are you ready to go?" she said. He looked around the room. She watched him do it. This man who had spent 6 years appearing twice a year and leaving before anyone could form an opinion, standing in the middle of the room without needing to leave. "Not yet," he said. She stood beside him and thought, there it is. Not the ending she would have written in September, sitting on the floor of the boarding house with her trunk half packed and her options down to one bad and one worse. Not any ending she'd have been able to imagine in October, saying all right in the cold outside a grain haul because the word had come up from somewhere below her planning. The truth was that most of the significant things in her life had arrived sideways, not through the doors she'd been watching, but through the ones she hadn't thought to look at. The drought had taken her family's land and she'd come west and found work, and then lost her housing and walked outside in a bad coat and said something honest to a man nobody wanted to sit near, and here she was, in spring, in a room full of people who knew her name, standing next to a man who'd chosen her specifically, not despite what she was, but because of it, because she came outside and said things that needed saying, because she kept moving when moving was hard, because she was flawed and tired and truthful, and that turned out to be exactly enough. She didn't think about what came next, not the formal arrangements still to be made, not the life to be built in the specific practical sense, not the mountain winters that would keep coming regardless of anything either of them wanted. She'd think about all of those things when they needed thinking about, because that was how you got through, not by solving everything at once, but by doing the next thing, and then the next, badly at first and then better, the way everything real gets done. For now the hall was warm and the fiddles were playing something slow, and outside the mountains were doing what they'd always done, standing over the valley, indifferent to its small negotiations, offering nothing except the hard and clarifying truth that the world was large and difficult, and that the only real shelter any of it provided was the kind you built yourself, out of work and honesty and the willingness to let someone stand on the same side of the door. That was the thing, she thought, not love as a feeling that descended. She'd been suspicious of that version her whole life, had watched it fail people she knew in ways they hadn't seen coming. But love is a choice made in conditions of full information. Love as, I see what you are, all the inconvenient and difficult parts, and I'm choosing this anyway. Darius had chosen her across a crowded room when the room was laughing. She'd chosen him in the cold in a bad coat because he told the truth about what it was. They were imperfect people who had looked at each other clearly and said yes, and the mountain had done the rest, stripping away everything that wasn't necessary and leaving what was. It wasn't a beautiful story. It wasn't the version anyone in Black Hollow would have predicted or chosen or arranged, but it was theirs, and it had happened in the specific way that real things happen, without grace, without smoothness, with difficulty and error and cold and the accumulated weight of two people deciding again and again to keep going. That, Eliza thought, was more than enough. That was everything.